webinar is by Paula Vedoveli, who is one of the conveners of the Financial History Network. So it's really interesting to have you here, Paula. Paula is an assistant professor of history at the School of International Relations at Getulio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. Her book manuscript is tentatively titled Brokering Capital, the Development of Latin American Public Credit at International Financial Markets, 1852-1914, which examines how Brazil and Argentina emerged as a massive debtors in the second half of the 19th century. So before we start, if you want to make any questions as we go along through the chat, then we will pick them up and put them out at the end. As usual, Paula knows very well how much time we have, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and thank you very much, Paula, for your presentation today.
Thank you, Bernardo, and thank you, my colleagues Manuel, Sergio, and Miguel, for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you. And thank you for coming, despite all the work you've done during the semester. I know this is a moment of a bit of relaxing, so I thank you doubly for coming here. So today I'm going to share with you this chapter I'm finishing writing. The title for now is Living into the Future, National Wealth, Repayment Capacity and Regimes of Credibility from 1890 to 1914. And just to give you a little background on how this chapter fits into the overall book project. So as Bernardo said, my book project is entitled Brokering Capital, and for the bulk of it, I examine how Brazil and Argentina became debtors through the figure of these credibility brokers, which were brokers of information. They managed the flow of information between sovereign debtors, between governments and creditors, especially in the figure of merchant bankers. And what I argue is that the bearing crisis creates a kind of disturbance regarding the viability of this credibility regime based on these highly personalized relationships. And what I analyze in the two last chapters of the manuscript is the emergence of a public regime of information of credibility based on the creation and dissemination of information through the work of what I call merchant of investments, which was a concept used by these actors themselves as they self-fashioned into a new category of finance professionals, and also the emergence of indicators as a technology of distance. And that's why I'm going to talk to you today about national wealth as a technology of distance. So this is a concept created by Porter, and I want to draw here a few key elements of indicators as technologies of distance. They facilitate comparisons and the production of simplified knowledge. They can compensate for what Porter calls informational disadvantage between those that are making decisions far away and those that have local knowledge. And as I'm going to argue, they support the creation and diffusion of expectations because numeric representations facilitate collective action and the transformation of uncertainty into risk, especially when the future is part of the decision-making process. So as I'm going to argue during this presentation, national wealth estimates helped promote confidence in sovereign debtors' repayment capacity because they contributed to turning uncertainty into risk through categorization, standardization, and interpretation. And therefore, narratives on country growth may be standardized, categorized with the help of national wealth estimates. So why narratives of national wealth and their estimates helped reduce uncertainty regarding sovereign repayment and transform it into risk, facilitate collective action, and underwrite expectations. First, because actors, and here I refer especially to financial writers, they mobilize national wealth as props. I'm following here Becker's terminology to ground their stories, narratives on countries' capacity for future growth. They did so by promoting a new regime of perceptibility whereby national wealth estimates and its associate language, I'm going to present to you one side of this associated language today, helped render visible elements that made these narratives plausible while also concealing antagonistic ones, therefore helping promote confidence in imagined futures. National wealth estimates were part of a category of statistics which, according to Mulhall, were intelligible to all nations, which allowed for comparisons in time and between countries. And as such, national wealth became part of the knowledge infrastructures that allow national economies to be known in the early 20th century. So one of the key elements of transformation that I examine in this chapter is the inclusion of the future into calculations and estimates of national wealth. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this now. So first of all, why national wealth is relevant here. So Robert Giffen, in his book, The Growth of Capital, he argues that estimates of national wealth were used by countries wishing to attract immigration and capital. National wealth became tied to that sustainability in investment opportunities in the early 20th century. So for example, you have O.P. Alston, which was the chief of the US Bureau of Statistics, arguing in 1901 that national wealth, or the growth of national wealth, could be associated with repayment capacity. The Investors' Review in 1909 arguing that national wealth was a better proxy of that sustainability than other measures of that burden. You have The Economist in 1910s arguing that the improvement in Japanese credit, despite expansion of debt, which was not accompanied by correspondent growth of foreign trade, was the result of political prestige of the Japanese government and the importance of clever advertisement even to a sovereign state. Finally, you have the Fortnightly Financial Review for Investors in 1910, arguing that if one wants to accumulate wealth, one should look where wealth is. And Harry Withers, renowned British financial writer, journalist, and writer of advice books on finance, arguing in 1910 that British credit was dependent on the wealth and the wealth producing capacity of the country, not on accounting problems. So what is national wealth in the early 20th century? So there was no consensus on what actually was constituted national wealth. You could have national wealth as the aggregate of private wealth, the aggregate of private wealth plus public properties, plus the productive capacity of nations, and as de Fauville argued in the early 20th century, as the aggregate of private wealth and income. And income becomes a category of importance in the early 20th century, not only due to preoccupations with the social question and the distributive question, but also in assessments of national wealth. And the inclusion of income, I argue, in calculations of national wealth created the capacity to include the future in processes of valuation of national wealth. Although there was no consensus regarding the definition of national wealth or how to calculate it, the techniques applicable to calculating national wealth and income estimates were used to indicate economic growth. So for example, in Helferich's 1913, Germany's economic progress and national wealth, which was recommended to British investors as a source to know the progress of nations. And what I trace as well is the popularization of national wealth estimates, including those in Mulhall's dictionaries, which are more or less well-known, and financial periodicals in the early 20th century. So here I bring you one of Mulhall's diagrams and pictorial visualizations of national wealth. You have on the top the total amount of national wealth per country, and below wealth per capita, which is we're gonna see becomes a standard category of a standard proxy for repayment capacity in the early 1920s. I wanna show you also here a spread which was included in the Cosmopolitan Financier, which was a British magazine published by a con artist, which was trying to sell his own securities, but it was interesting that this spread was taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica and showed not only total amounts of national wealth per country and per items of wealth, but also these diagrams which sought to compare the wealth, render visually these comparisons of the wealth of countries, the items of wealth, and on the top with a bar graph, you can see wealth per capita. So Flandreau and Zuma have argued in 2009 book that measures of that burden was taken as measures of that sustainability in the 19th century, and they were seen as the best proxies of sovereign creditworthiness. And I question this assumption by looking at the work, for example, of Dudley Baxter, which who in a 1871 well-known book assessed and criticized available techniques to measure that burden and believed that burden was not a good measure of that sustainability. And he did this by resorting to the example of the US, which he used to argue that the probable growth of income of the country rendered the present debt of the US insignificant, thus pointing to this the possibility of the future creeping into assessments of that sustainability. Then you have Robert Keithen, which I introduced already in his well-known book, arguing that debt to national wealth was a better basis to assess debt sustainability, as national wealth indicated the present stock of assets available for repayment, and also resorting to the example of the US, arguing that the growth of income was based on the undeveloped resources of the US. We are going to see that this is an important point in these narratives. And finally, Bastable, who wrote a very important book on public finance in 1892, arguing that measures of national wealth and income were more reliable tests of that burden. He offered the ratio of debt to national wealth or the ratio of annual debt service to national income as the proxies for this test. And here again, I resort to one of Mulhall's visual descriptions or depictions, of this idea of using ratio of debt to national wealth, especially on the half below of the image, to give a sense of debt sustainability, that burden. So if debt burden or traditional debt burden measures were not seen exactly as good measures of that sustainability, what was, right? So here refer to this process, which I try to trace in this chapter, of the capitalization of national wealth. And I argue that the capitalization of national wealth allowed to displace measures of that burden when convenient. For example, when a country had defaulted, or when it had like high in the indices of that burden, for example, in the case of Russia. But why capitalization? And I bring here some key definitions. For example, I could argue that capitalization was a process whereby future income flows are translated into a present stock of wealth. John Levy argued that capital valuation is prospective, always occurring under conditions of uncertainty. Muniz and Dolganova, in a recent article, have argued that capitalization is a process of turning things into objects of investment, prone to producing returns in the future. And David Peeling, which have noted that today's wealth is the basis of tomorrow's income. So this idea that the process of capitalization of wealth not only brings the future into estimates and calculations of wealth, but also is prone to turn the object of capitalization into an investment. And then I ask you, but how national wealth came to be imagined as one of the bases of a country's productive capacity and productivity, right? The capitalization of national wealth allowed to include expectations about the future into narratives and techniques of valuation of that sustainability. And then the question here remains, how to discount a country's capacity for future growth? The answer is looking at the future. but is the future subject to calculation calculable, right? So there is this important dissertation by Monica Paul Fraser, and she examines how French and German bankers dealt with risk management, and she argued that for these bankers, the future was not calculable because the very absence of calculability in this case is what made profit possible, right? At the same time, in the early 20th century, I show in this work, the future becomes central in financial periodicals and as part of a narrative in its centrality in investment decisions, and is domesticated as an object of calculation via practices of discounting. And I know this has a very long history, just looking at my colleague William Derringer here in his work, and the calculation of securities' inherent value. And here I go back to Muniz and Doganova's definition of inherent value, which looks at the future to assess the security's capacity to create value tomorrow. And here I bring you a cartoon which was published in the Ticker, which was the former the magazine of Wall Street in 1909, and the cartoon is the wrong way and the right way, right? So you have a person looking the wrong way, studying the present conditions of railroads, and the right way is looking at its future prospects at the future. So can the future value of the wealth of countries be valued and known in the present? Can we discount the value of future wealth? The emergence in the early 20th century of national wealth as a form of national valuation, which could be used to assess a country's capacity to create value tomorrow via processes of capitalization that helped turn a country in an investment, is the process that I'm tracing now. This was dependent on intellectual and political innovations, as well as the work of financial writers, these new merchants of investment as creators and promoters of expectations, right? They sought to shape how readers interpreted national wealth estimates and narratives, and use them to draw and guide investors' attention and resources, acting as attention merchants. So now I want to analyze these political and intellectual innovations. So first you have, for example, Pontus Folbäck, who argues in a paper to the International Institute of Statistics that when calculating national wealth, one must distinguish between present and future wealth. However, do not include future wealth into calculations because it's in the form of undeveloped resources. You have Roger Babson, well-known American forecaster, which includes national wealth as indicator of national prosperity used to assess investment prospects, distinguish between present and latent wealth, and argue that latent wealth was the only reliable basis of future prosperity. You have Irving Fisher, which is here to the narrative, the story I'm trying to trace, which introduced the concept of capital value as the present value of capital, including the expectation of future return, and was criticized by book reviewers who noted the challenges associated with value expectations. And you have two other important contributions, J.B. Crozier, who in a series of articles for the Financial Review of Reviews in 1910, argued that the only factor that explained the rise in the value of government security was the growth of the real productive value of the country, as it supported its ability and willingness to repay. So credit worthiness reflected present circumstances in the form of its accumulated wealth and a country's wealth producing power. And the latter was a true measure of that sustainability. Thus, Crozier recommended investors to place their capital in countries of great potential wealth like Brazil and Argentina. And finally, Gustav Kohn, a German political economist who argued that the difference in the wealth of countries explained difference in the interest rate of loans. And in the political / intellectual side of things, we have Alberto Martinez, who was an Argentine statistician and public official, who argued in 1902 against the applicability of traditional techniques of measuring that burden to Argentina, arguing that such measurements were not applicable to a young country like Argentina, where there was rapid expansion of population and wealth. Argue that debt burden ratios do not account for a country's capacity for future growth. And finally, argue that debt burden must be assessed according to a country's vitality and resources and calculated with regards to public wealth and its prospects for increase in development. Adding that a country's future wealth is a relative guarantee / security for its repayment capacity. And it's interesting that 7 years later, in a report to the Argentine government, the Argentine finance minister recovers some of Martinez's arguments, trying to focus investors' attention on Argentina's capacity to create value in the future, also by criticizing available measures of that burden and proposing the adoption of an index of wealth. And here he tries with available numbers to point to what a possible index of wealth looked like, which compared population, foreign trade per capita, exports per capita, and debt per capita. So what made narratives such as Argentina's index of wealth credible? So first you have the capital value, the process of calculating the capital value of assets by focusing on its expected income. So national wealth estimates focused also on public and private assets such as land, house, mines. You have also the legacy of 18th and 19th century response to how to value public assets such as forests to solve problems of temporal inconsistency, such as the trade-off between valuing forest, taking the current prices of wood or timber versus valuing the forest capacity for future yield. This has a bearing on the present because, for example, you have Japanese narratives on the income derived from public forests being used to alleviate concerns with high taxation burden regarding the country's debt repayment capacity in 1909. You have Russia also using the country's assets as a source of credit worthiness against measures of that burden. Brazil using natural wealth as sources of confidence in the country. And here I brought 2-3 examples of that. So for example, in 1909, one actor who was an important person behind the Financial Review of Review, arguing that while Argentina was being over discounted, the Argentine prosperity was being over discounted, Brazil's basis for future prosperity was sounder because they were grounded on country's assets. And then a few years later, also tying the rising Brazilian securities being explained by the country's resource and trying to dismiss the financial crisis in Brazil as temporary and arguing it should not hinder investors' confidence in the country. And here I bring you a map which was published as part of one of those advertising campaigns led by sovereign borrowers. In the case of Brazil, the Economic Expansion and Propaganda Initiative, which was in Paris, and this was a map of an economic map of the country, focusing on the commodities and natural resources that the country produced. And here just a quote, supposedly, allegedly a quote of J.P. Morgan about don't discount the future of America. Remember that the great growth of this vast country would take care of all. Also signaling to this importance of narratives of growth and discounting growth. And now I want to finish with the post-war story, what happens right after the war, because the war is an important intervening factor in how these estimates are being used to assess investment opportunity and sovereign credibility. First, I'm argue that it's because of the war and not only the war that you have a consolidation of the distinctions between ability and willingness to repay. The first due to war finance demands, and the second, for example, due to Russian repudiation. The post-war story is focused on productive capacity, productivity, and how they explain ability to repay. So, for example, you have J.L. Laughlin in the Credit of Nations in 1918, arguing that a state pledges its future producing power in return for present purchase power, arguing also that credit transforms future production into present means of payments, that confidence in ability to repay was tied to maintenance of a country's productive capacity, and that capacity to borrow was tied to national wealth and states' capacity to derive income by taxing national wealth. So in the US, Wall Street starts promoting more aggressively foreign investment in Latin America, public and private securities after the war. So you have, for example, Albert Kimber, who was at the time vice president of Fitch Publishing Company, in a book in 1919, arguing that public credit was the confidence in ability and willingness to repay, including national wealth, amongst the factors that determined public credit, resorting to the example of the US again, showing that the growth of population and national wealth from 1860 to 1912 showed the reduction of the debt burden despite the expansion of debt. And questioning the utility of national wealth estimates, because he argued that investors should focus not only on a country's present stock of wealth, but on its capacity to produce new wealth from national resources and productivity. You have also Keyes, former vice president of National City Bank of New York, in a paper to the Annals of the American Political Science Academy in 1920, arguing that Latin American countries had increased national wealth during the war, which made their securities more valuable, grounding Argentina's and Brazil's possibility for future growth upon the natural resources, and arguing that national wealth and the potential resources of country underwrote the security for their loans. And here I end with this great article published in the Moody's Investor Service, which was a weekly letter by the Moody's company. In the title of the article is "The Wealth and Credit of Foreign Nations." And the article notes that the growth of foreign borrowing in US raised demand for information on sovereign borrowers, and suggesting that wealth per capita was the most important index of creditworthiness to be assessed, examined alongside of other factors such as taxability, which was tied to national wealth per capita, national income, among others. And here I just bring you again this bar graph on wealth per capita as one of the indices that are going to be consolidated as a proxy of repayment capacity of creditworthiness. So that's what I have for you today. I really appreciate your coming and look forward to your comments and questions. And if you want to contact me, here's my email and Twitter handle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paula. It was a fascinating presentation. And while we have the questions coming in, I'll take the lead as chair and give you and ask you to more than a question, if you could expand a little bit on your methodology. And narratives are something that is beginning to get currency, to be widely adopted, but you have all sorts of things, and in your case you're also using some of the images and graphs as part of your narrative. So if you could tell us a little bit more about your methodology and how you deal with this. Yeah.
So I think that the greatest challenge here is to trace the impact of this narrative, right? And it's really hard because you cannot really get into the mind of foreign investors and see whether national wealth was really an important element in defining or in shaping their decisions where to invest. So I'm trying to do here more of intellectual history of how national wealth became part of this scholarly and political conversation on sovereign credibility, and also tying to some social processes such as the war, such as Argentina's attempt to resume heavy borrowing, such as, Brazil's attempts at advertising its capacity for future growth. But I agree that there are a lot of challenges to this, especially how representative these sources are. But as you said, we have become more interested in narratives because there is this movement in highlighting how they shape decision making. But I also would love to hear what people think about this kind of work, right? Trying to do the work with this kind of sources, and also the difficulties of assessing the impact of these narratives.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think we have John Handel, who's raised his hand, and then Sergio. John, if you want to open your mic, please.
Hi, Paula. As you can see per my first chat, I'm in bed. But that
Thank you for coming.
It was my pleasure. That was a terrific presentation. So I have 3 questions. I'll try and keep them brief, and you can answer as many or as few as you'd like. The first question is to ask you if you can maybe disaggregate a little bit more between the concepts that you were talking about, wealth on the one hand, national wealth on the one hand, and debt sustainability on the other. Because the thing I'm interested in this is, like, there seems to be the problem of like liquidity here, which is a country could be naturally wealthy in terms of like having a lot of land or capital stock, but that doesn't necessarily translate into it having the kinds of liquid wealth that it would need to continually pay debts. So I'm wondering about that tension in the work, both how you're approaching it, how your sources approached it. The second one sort of piggybacks on the first question a little bit. So you clearly do focus a lot on journalists here and financial press, but it seemed also like a lot of the guys you're talking about are statisticians and economists. And so I'm wondering where you really think the like big causal agency that is driving the creation of this narrative is coming from, if it is really journalists, or if it's like coming out of these more econometric spaces and then just sort of being translated into journalism. And then the last question is just to sort of maybe put this in a longer scope of how we've thought about national wealth and the future. So you were talking about how, important the future is to these calculations, but on some level that goes back to the Latin American debt boom in the 1820s, right? Like there's all these guys talking about how there are so many unexploited resources there, and if we invest now, the future is going to be more profitable in these countries and whatnot. And so is the difference here really just like the methods of calculation, or is there something larger that's being changed? So that was a lot. Sorry, you can answer again as many or as few of those as you'd like.
No, this was fantastic, and thank you very much for coming and thinking with me about those questions. So the first one about disaggregating national wealth, and debt sustainability. So it's very, it's funny because what I think that solves this problem is that, and again, another technique of narrative creation, which is the idea of capital value, which is pointing to the possible income that can be derived of these assets, right? If the government works these assets well. So this is how they seek to resolve this tension. So for example, you have, I use the example of the Japanese forest. They say, since the Japanese government is so good with the governance of its public resources, it can derive income from its forests without destroying it. And this alleviates the debt burden. This makes the debt sustainable. So I think that this is how they solve this problem. So the second question is, and I love how your questions are things that I have been thinking about, and I'm not sure if I have great answers to them, but that's why I don't say it's financial journalists. I kind of refer to them as financial writers, and I know that's not a great term to be employed, because there is this kind of interchange, or how I'm going to say, intervisibility of journalists and economists and statisticians, because they are writing in these more popular magazines, but also in more technical magazines. And you have journalists who write in technical magazines because they derive their expertise for the first observation of I forgot the concept right now, in this first base observation, right? The fact that they were there, they saw, and then they can narrate on these events. And it's very interesting as well how these journalists sometimes resort to the authority of economists when using national wealth estimates and when creating narratives of country prosperity based on national wealth estimates. And I have an example of the Financial Review of Reviews saying that, you know, you should invest in Argentina because that's how economists see the greater wealth of the country being developed. So I would say that they are kind of trying to occupy the same space and reinforcing each other's narratives. And the second one is, the third one is actually how different this is from what was happening in the 19th century, the early 19th century. So you have a lot of narratives on the future, the natural riches of the country. In Flandreau is very good at pointing out that this was criticized by the 1875 Committee on Foreign Loans, saying that the natural riches of these countries were being exaggerated. So I think that the difference is, first, you have a whole scholarly intellectual debate trying to underwrite this idea that you can derive income and from assets, from latent wealth, and you can also not only derive income, but grow your wealth from these undeveloped resources. The first thing is this is lending credibility, legitimacy to these narratives. And the second one is also the idea of valuation, right? That you're saying it's just whether or not the future is being calculated or becoming part of calculation. So I think that this is part of the story, yes. And part of the reason is the breakthroughs, for example, of Irving Fisher trying to develop the idea of capital wealth, but also separating, distinguishing capital from income. So I think these are the two main reasons, though I myself am not totally satisfied with that. I think, as Eli Cook said, and a lot of great colleagues said, when you invest, you have to be able to imagine some sort of future where there's profit, right? But the question is, can you value this future? Can you discount this future? Can you underwrite this future with index and proxies of that sustainability of repayment capacity? So this is what I'm trying to think here. Thank you again.
I'll just say, I think that mostly makes sense to me. Like the fact that it's this sort of limitless future at the beginning of the 19th century, and by the late 19th, early 20th century, it has to be like a very precisely calculated future.
Yes, a bounded future.
So yeah, I buy that. So
thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, John. Sergio, and then Dongyan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Bernardo, and thank you, Paula, for an amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it a lot. And well, I was thinking, and my question goes in terms of your future plans or your plans for this particular project, in the sense that I see so much potential and I see it connected to so many other areas of research or to a broader part of economic historiography, in the sense of you talk about how to measure wealth before Keynes and the appearance of macroeconomics. So I don't know if you're at some point connecting to that, and also in a conversation that's still quite relevant in terms of how we measure wealth and how we measure economic growth and development, and the research agenda of people that are like Christian Duquang in Lund, trying to change with the use of economic history, current understanding of economic growth and measurements such as GDP. And you talked about a discussion in the 70s, 80s between rational expectations and adaptive expectations in the picture you show us with the railroads, and something that I didn't know existed before that point. And I thought everyone was just using adaptive expectations and looking at the present and the past, where you're talking about forward-looking expectations, how they were built and used in the early 20th century. But I think there are so many lines that I was seeing there. The appearance and relevance at the birth of credit rating agencies and how to measure sovereign risk, how they do it currently, if it was used. So I saw you went and covered such a big area of like so many different topics. So I was wondering if this is a book you're planning, if you're thinking of connecting, or like how these avenues are appearing within your work, which I think it's amazing and has like so much opportunities and potential. So I was wondering what roles are you thinking of going through?
Thank you, Sergio, for a very generous comment. So the plan is to finish the book and publish first, but my next project, and I love the title, and that's more or less what I have for now. It's Making Global Numbers, which should look at the rise of macroeconomic indicator and other index from the global south. And I'm still thinking about what cases I'm gonna look at, probably Brazil, Chile, and Angola, and I'm still figuring around that. So that's where I would like to talk more about, all this infrastructure for measuring growth, for seeing the national economy, for comparing national economies, for thinking about development, which, as you noted, is an important part of the story because it has a lot of distributive consequences as access to loans, right, with the IMF, with the World Bank in the 60s and the 70s, all the discourse on conditionality later on. So it would be a book where I start where I stopped in the last, in this book I'm finishing now, and I go into the 1980s, more or less. But I'm still working on that. I'm on the phase where I'm looking at possible archives, and I have been trying to contact credit rating agencies, but I don't think they are very willing to let me in and look at what they have, but I'm still gonna keep insisting on that. So yeah, that's what on my future, and definitely you identify all the key interventions I would like to make with that.
Thank you very much, and yeah, do keep us. Let us know when you publish your book. Keep us updated.
I will definitely.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you very much, Sergio. Dongyan, please.
Hi, thanks for a really fascinating talk around. My question, I got two questions. So the first one I noticed, it seems that sort of what you talked about in terms of national wealth is very much positively correlated with natural wealth, and in a way negatively or inversely correlated with population in a sense. And for that particular period, do you see in your work there is any sort of a stress by these financial journalists on particular, say, industriousness of the population, activity of the population for that period? So that's the first one. The second one is, I see that sort of towards after the Great War, you seem to be emphasizing more about the capacity of the state capacity, whether it's in the sense of willingness to service these debts or not. Does that hint towards a turn towards monitoring more about the ways of governance, as opposed to, say, the simply calculating or sort of measuring the state of the natural wealth or state of the population, that kind of stuff, rather than essentially refocusing that on how these governments are actually being governed, or that kind of stuff.
No, thank you for these great questions. I even got here, I had planned to put a slide on what I call the population variable, because these are part of the factors of wealth, right, in 19th and early 20th century. So aside from natural riches, you have discourses, narratives based on the growth of population, and they matter because, population can mean a larger tax base, can become, elements that increase production, income-bearing assets. So the population is seen as a mark of distinction between old countries, which had accumulated wealth, in young countries whose ability to produce new wealth was also dependent not only on natural riches, but on the population, because this is what would allow it to explore these reaches. So definitely this is the part of the story. I just didn't include it here because I didn't think it was, I would have time, and I was right, would not have time. So the other question, state capacity, I think it's fascinating because I was thinking whether the focus on state capacity after World War was not only a question of governance, but also the mobilization of resources, right? How the World War I really showed to the public the state capacity of mobilizing, allocating resources, but also creating new techniques of measurement. And here Alden Too's works on German statistics comes to mind. So for example, Flandreau and Zuma would, they argue that after the banking crisis, there was this focus on governance. So they say that there was a transition between trade test, which looked at foreign trade as a source of, to measure that burden, from tax test, which looked at tax as a way to measure that burden. I couldn't see exactly this transition, so I agree with you that it's possibly the war which allows to focus on governance through state capacity and ways of measuring, assessing this. So thank you so much for that.
All right.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. If anybody wants to raise their hand or just open their microphone now, because we don't have any more raised hands. No?
I can throw a few more in there if you want.
Yes, please, John.
Because I thought this was a very generative talk. So on Dong's point with the population question, I mean, I think this might be another place that you can highlight, I think, the historical development of this particular time, because I mean, this is a very loose summary of literature, but again, in this like 18th and early 19th century moment, right, it was this sort of aggregate population was one of these key measures of wealth, and they didn't really think about it in terms of a larger matrix of like what might be an optimal population or even the industriousness of the population or whatever. And it seems that like that's one of these things that is clearly changing in your period. So that might just be another way of sort of distinguishing the regime of credibility and national wealth that you're talking about, this late 19th, early 20th century moment from what came before. And then the second thing, I guess, this is related to my question on debt sustainability and national wealth and credibility, but you didn't say anything about monetary system or the gold standard. So I know there's a lot of debate on this, but you know, one of those sort of long-standing features of this literature is that moving on to the gold standard in this period was an indicator of one's credibility to repay debts, and it was also in some senses an indicator of good governance too. Like this being able to manage your currency within this was something that spoke to many different aspects of one's state capacity and finances. So I'm wondering where that fits into this narrative, and if it's because I don't think you really talk about monetary regimes at all.
Yeah, thank you for this, John. So I'm going to start with the last one. And I don't think I agree that monetary governance was really important in this period. And I argue this because when I look at all those manuals and articles on what constitutes offering credibility, creditworthiness, and how to measure, sometimes authors make a very timid reference to monetary reform, but I even found one that said, okay, that's fine. There's no problem with the floating currencies, right? As long as you're not inflating the currency in order to look like you are able to pay the debts. So it seems like it's not that relevant, and I'm not the first one to argue that. For example, again, Flandreau and Zuma have argued that as well, that monetary reform or monetary stability, the adoption of the gold standard was not that important. Regarding the first one, I agree with you. I have to think more about how to relate this population variable with the cameralists in late 18th century, early 19th century, with looked at population as one measures of the strength of the state, right? As one way of measure and compare states. But I still have to think more about where the change is here, right? If it's just thinking about population as agents of production or agents, individuals who produce income, where is the shift here? But thank you, I have to think about this question more.
And I would just add too, like on the gold standard question, like I'm also not, convinced that the gold standard is some sort of end all be all of monetary or financial stability. But I think it might be worth, and maybe you do this in the longer thing, just sort of pushing on that. Yeah, if not to say like, because I think there's two ways that it could go, which is one, what's interesting that your work I think pretty clearly proves is that at least a lot of people at the time didn't even really think that the gold standard was that important, which is an interesting point on its own. And then I think sort of pushing on this idea of, whether or not it actually did sort of factor into calculations. And so, yeah, playing with that and pushing a little more on that narrative, I think could sort of bring out more of the important work that you're doing here.
Yeah, and I have to think this with regard to the feature of many loans being issued in gold, right? They were not pegged to the fluctuations of local currencies, but to the gold, which reduced the risk. So the question is here, how long-term investors could think, right? What was the time horizon that would allow them to look at the security? Oh, this is, denominated in gold, so that's fine, because actually I'm not looking at the fundamentals of this economy behind this bond, this piece of paper, and whether perhaps national wealth estimates and the narratives associated with it, the national resources, population, were a way of focusing investors' attention in this short-term gains, instead of really examining long-term fundamentals. Perhaps that's a way to look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Can I jump in here and just kind of like quickly go back to my question about the population thing? Do you feel that sort of in your stuff, your research, in a sense, did you see this emphasis on population? Do they simply emphasize the productive part of the story, or do they give any mention about the potentials of these population as being potential consumers? And does that form a part of the calculation of the national wealth?
So one change that I looked at, and in the mid-19th century, so the old story, Barry sent representatives to Argentina, and this representative had a conversation with the Argentine government in which he said, we take the population as a proxy of a capacity to repay. Not with these words exactly, but they were saying like, one of the ways we can kind of see that Argentina is growing through the growth of population. But then in the early 20th century, what we have is the diffusion of the theory of international international geographical diversification of investments, which focus a lot on foreign trade and international foreign trade. And they say that population is important because as population grow, it also grows foreign trade because, they are able to produce and consume more. So that's the link you're looking at is due to the popularization of the theory, which is also an incentive for European investors to invest their capital abroad, right? Because the premise is that you're not safe just by diversifying by industries, you also have to diversify by countries and regions. So that's where the link is.
Oh, right, fascinating.
Right. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. Thank you very much, John, Dong, Sergio, for the questions. Of course, Paula, for a super presentation.
Thank you.
And super interesting. And I want to take advantage of reminding you from Sergio's message that you are kindly invited to join us at our next and last event of the current academic year, which will have a keynote talk, the Second Bank of the United States, Central Banker in an Era of National Building, by Professor Jane Noddle, and who is the Mark J. Swindenberg Green Gold Professor of Financial History at the University of Vermont. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.